Welcome to this explainer. When we think of medieval castles today, it is incredibly easy to just picture this romantic fairy tale image. We think of towering spires, serene landscapes, elegant stone walls, right? But honestly, that modern perception completely glosses over their brutal reality. These structures absolutely were not built for aesthetics. They were ruthless, highly engineered military kill zones. So today, we're going to strip away the romance and look at the gritty, technological arms race of medieval castle architecture, focusing specifically on the incredible lengths people went to in order to defend the most vulnerable terrain on Earth. Okay, let's kick things off with a seemingly illogical question. Why on earth would anyone choose to build a massive, impossibly heavy stone castle in the middle of a flood-prone marshland or a muddy lowland? I mean, if you're a medieval lord looking for safety, flat, wet land is exactly where you don't want to be. But sometimes controlling a specific trade route or river valley meant you basically had no choice. Defending these flat, highly vulnerable lowland areas required an incredible, high-stakes hydraulic engineering solution. And that engineering solution gave rise to the Wasserschloss, which is the German term for water castle. Now, notice how this isn't some ornamental pond for swans. We're talking about a fortified residence entirely surrounded by an artificial moat or natural lake. The water was specifically designed as an impassable barrier in lowland terrains where natural cliffs and mountains were completely absent. Now, when we talk about water castles, we immediately think of the moat, but the history of that word is actually fascinating. It derives from the Middle English moat and Old French, which surprisingly originally didn't just mean water. It described the raised dirt mound that was paired with a defensive ditch, a design tracing all the way back to early Viking ring forts. Over time, as hydraulic engineering advanced, the term shifted to emphasize just the water-filled trench itself. To truly appreciate this, try comparing the flat marshlands to classic Stauffer-era hilltop castles. Up on a mountain, a steep cliff does most of the defending for you. Attackers can often only approach from one single side. But down in a swamp, you have to artificially engineer a massive 360-degree aquatic barrier from scratch. The defenders were entirely exposed otherwise, meaning the engineering literally had to be flawless. Section 1. Engineering a medieval marvel. Transitioning from a dry hilltop to a flooded swamp required megastructures that exacted an immense physical and financial toll. Building a medium-sized stone fortress wasn't just a quick weekend project. It was a generational commitment. We're talking 10 to 15 years just to construct the core of a medium-sized stone castle. This required staggering financial resources and a workforce of dozens of specialized craftsmen. Master builders, stonemasons, blacksmiths, carpenters, working right alongside local peasants who are often conscripted to haul heavy materials out of the forests and quarries. So, the crucial point is, how do you actually build a heavy stone tower in the mud? Well, you have to master advanced hydraulic engineering. Step 1, you isolate the building site by constructing cofferdams. These are temporary wooden enclosures packed with clay to keep the water out. Step 2, you drive massive timber piles deep down into the soft waterlogged soil to create a stable foundation that won't sink. And step 3, you have to frantically erect your primary masonry structures in this artificially dry space before you eventually unleash the rivers and fully flood the moats. It was gritty, incredibly dangerous work. This brilliantly illustrates the sheer physical labor involved in building those walls. In regions like the Palatinate, builders heavily favored red sandstone, or buntsandstein, which was relatively easy to work with but incredibly heavy. To lift these blocks, they used trætrædkranen. These were massive cranes powered literally by human sweat, with workers walking endlessly inside giant wooden tread wheels. The walls themselves used zweischellen technique, basically a two-shell masonry technique, where two outer walls of cut stone were filled in the middle with a solid core of rubble and mortar. And for the exterior facing the enemy, they used buckelquader, highly textured, protruding stones that were super expensive to craft, serving as a visible, massive symbol of the Lord's wealth and a terrifying psychological deterrent. Section 2. Harnessing the power of water. Once the massive stone walls were up, the engineers faced a completely different, continuous battle. Managing the water itself. This water was the castle's greatest defense for sure, but if mismanaged, it was a lethal environmental hazard. Water management in the Middle Ages was remarkably sophisticated. To prevent uncontrolled flooding from heavy rains, engineers installed complex systems of dams and adjustable wooden sluice gates to regulate flow. They also had to constantly fight nature by manually dredging mud and sediment so the moat wouldn't fill up and lose its defensive depth. Crucially, they used purge pipes to flush out stagnant, foul-smelling water that posed severe health risks. But perhaps the most surprising fact here is that a moat wasn't just a barrier. It was basically a defensive grocery store. They stocked it with freshwater fish like carp, providing a vital source of protein that sustained the castle inhabitants during times of isolation. Section 3. Surviving a medieval siege. And that brings us perfectly to the ultimate test of all this engineering. How did these features actually function when a hostile army showed up at the gates? The disparity here is just staggering. For the attacking army, it's pure misery. Water completely prevents them from rolling heavy siege towers or battering rams up to the walls. Scaling ladders become useless because the water adds meters to the height they have to climb. And the most popular medieval siege tactic, tunneling under a wall to collapse it, is impossible because any tunnel would instantly flood. For the defenders sitting pretty on the other side, they have isolated kill zones, they have the psychological high ground, and with fish in the moat and water securely inside, they are largely self-sustained. Speaking of water inside, defenders went to absolute extremes to secure fresh, uncontaminated drinking water because you definitely couldn't drink the stagnant moat water. At Berwartstein Castle, they literally bored a well 74 meters deep straight down through solid rock. That is a staggering achievement using only medieval hand tools taking years to complete. When drilling just wasn't an option, they had to rely on water donkeys to constantly shuttle water into the fortress during peacetime, filling massive cisterns to prepare for war. Section 4. The Gunpowder Revolution. But no matter how deep the moat or how high the walls, everything changed with the arrival of the ultimate technological disruption. Let's quickly trace the timeline of how cannons fundamentally shifted the paradigm of static defense. In the 12th century, water castles were rising and dominating the landscape. But in 1453, a shockwave hit the world, the fall of Constantinople. Ottoman artillery completely shattered the city's legendary double walls and moats. By the 16th century, the writing was on the wall, and lords started transitioning their water castles away from military use, turning them into luxury estates. By the 17th century, high stone walls were considered fully obsolete against modern artillery. As the historical analysis from our sources notes perfectly, and I quote, "Traditional high walls and static water defenses, once formidable against siege engines, became vulnerable to breaching, rendering moats largely obsolete as primary obstacles. Gunpowder completely shattered the centuries-old idea that a high wall and a wide puddle meant absolute security. Attackers no longer had to cross the water, they could just blast the castle to pieces from afar." This forced a total redesign in military architecture. Pre-gunpowder, the philosophy was all about height, high vertical stone walls and deep moats with a tall centralized keep. Post-gunpowder, engineers, like the famous Vauban, completely flipped the script. Fortresses became low profile. They utilized wide, angled earthworks designed specifically to absorb the kinetic energy of heavy cannon fire, rather than shatter under it. Moats didn't disappear entirely, but they became shallow, floodable secondary features rather than the main event. Section 5. Castles in the modern world. Now, these ancient megastructures survived medieval siege engines, and many survived the gunpowder revolution by transitioning into country homes. But today, they are facing a highly ironic new threat. The very elements that gave these castles their power are threatening to destroy them. Climate change is causing wild fluctuations. Severe droughts, like the historic one Europe experienced in 2022, are drying out moats, causing the ancient timber foundations beneath the mud to desiccate, rot, and destabilize the stone walls above. Conversely, increased riverine flooding threatens to overwhelm their historic water management systems. Add in invasive aquatic species and the astronomical millions of dollars a year maintenance costs for dredging and algae control, and these heritage sites are in a desperate fight for survival. It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? The forces of nature, water, and climate are actively threatening to destroy the very foundations that medieval armies and early gunpowder couldn't bring down. These castles stand as monumental testaments to human ingenuity and our desperate need for security. But it leaves us with a provocative question to consider. As we engineer our own megastructures today, what modern monuments will we leave behind, and how will they fare in their own inevitable battle against the elements centuries from now? Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history built into the world around us.